Boa tarde, pessoal. Boa tarde, professor Tavares. Good afternoon, Professor Olivia. It's an honor to have you here. Bom, eu queria começar agradecendo a presença de todos vocês nesse seminário super especial de hoje. O nosso tema vai ser Escondidos em Plena Vista, colonialismo, capitalismo e racismo, até onde os olhos podem ver. A gente está contando hoje aqui com a palestrante Olivia Rutazibwa, e eu vou fazer uma breve introdução sobre as experiências acadêmicas dela na área. Ela é doutora em Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais pela Universidade de Ghent, na Bélgica. Ela trabalha como professora sênior de Estudos Europeus e Internacionais na Universidade de Portsmouth, no Reino Unido. Também é pesquisadora sênior do Instituto de Estudos Avançados de Joanesburgo, já estagiou na Comissão Europeia de Bruxelas e no Instituto de Estudos de Segurança da União Europeia, em Paris. Ela é coeditora do Routledge Handbook of Post-Colonial Politics. Recentemente ingressou no conselho editorial da International Politics Review e do Review of International Studies. Já trabalhou como editora, jornalista e colunista da revista Mo, de Bruxelas. Em 2011, ela já deu uma palestra no TEDx, intitulada Decolonizing Western Minds, que eu vou deixar, inclusive, o link para vocês assistirem, se quiserem, aqui na descrição do vídeo. E também, por fim, ela já escreveu um artigo com o mesmo título do nosso seminário de hoje, que eu já mandei para algumas pessoas, e vou deixar o link dele na descrição, caso vocês se interessem em pesquisar um pouquinho mais, ele é muito bom. E, além disso, hoje a gente está aqui com o nosso professor da PUC Minas, do campo Poços de Caldas, o Vinícius Tavares, que vai estar atuando como moderador do nosso seminário. Antes de começar, eu queria lembrar todo mundo que a gente vai abrir para uma sessão de perguntas no final da palestra. Então, vocês podem ir deixando as eventuais dúvidas aqui no chat do YouTube mesmo, que a gente vai traduzir para o inglês, passar para a nossa palestrante responder, e eu fico à disposição aqui no backstage para qualquer coisa que vocês precisarem durante esse tempo. Então, agora eu passo a palavra para o professor Vinícius. Obrigado, gente.
Obrigado, João. Eu vou falar em inglês para poder agradecer a nossa palestrante. So, Olivia, thank you very much for being here with us. It's an honor to have you here. We've been having very good seminars throughout the world, and it's an absolute honor to be with you here, such an inspirational academic, and not only for me, but I have to tell you, we have this official Instagram account of our course, and we have like some sort of celebrities in the area, and I believe that you were the first one to be displayed. I don't know, João can confirm that maybe, but you were the first one because, you know, it was the first person that came to my mind, and others as well. So it's such an honor to be here with you. As João said, we'll be taking questions either in Portuguese or in English. So those who asked in Portuguese, I'll be translating for you. And welcome in Brazil. I mean, it's easy time.
Thank you very much. Let me put the timer, because I always say I'm going to speak for a very short time and then I start talking and then before we know it. So thank you so much for having me. I think, COVID and lockdown has been very tough on many people for many different reasons. Mine is a more privileged one. I genuinely miss literally going on a plane, stuffing my stuff in a tiny compartment and just being on the other side of the world. So I don't know. I have to commend, I think, the fact that we found a way to still travel and be in each other's classrooms. So I really, really thank you for this invitation. And I also want to have it on record that I want to do this in person someday in the future. And I will, I will return the invitation as well. So for today's talk, maybe if we can have the first slide, I can do it myself. Yeah, exactly, perfect. So the title is Hidden in Plain Sight, Coloniality, Capitalism, and then Racism, as far as the eye can see. And I put it up there because it speaks to a very particular review article I wrote. And usually I wouldn't talk about the publication because it doesn't have a meaning in and of itself, but some of the comments I want to make today are literally around the possibilities and impossibilities of of both engaging with these topics within international relations, but also very much these types of publications. So that's somehow the background. The other pictures that you see is one is the red picture is an illustration from an article in Foreign Policy, and I'll come back to it. And the two others are actually pictures that I have from an exhibition of tricontinental artwork, and it was an exhibition in London. And I'll come back to the visuals as well in some of the themes I want to address. But, you know, I've been introduced already quite extensively. And I guess for me today, I'm speaking very much as somebody who's trained both in international relations. I've been teaching international development for the last 8 years. I used to work as a journalist, as you heard, but also more and more, I'm trying to think through the implications of I guess a positionality as a second generation Rwandan, born and raised in Belgium, dual nationality, and today living in the UK. All of that on a personal level is not that important or that exceptional. And, you know, obviously when I'm speaking to an audience in Brazil, those things become even more clear. The reason why I bring it up is that I think for many of us, myself and others in the audience, we might not be the people that tend to be centered in our discipline. And when I say centered, I mean very much as experts and authors and all of that. So I want actually us to walk a bit through the implications of what happens when we reject that. And I think some of the themes that I put in the title here very much speak to that. So if I could have the next slide, and I leave it up here just for a second, just to walk us through I don't know if I can click on the next slide, just to give us a sense of how I'm going to structure this talk. Jao, I don't know if you can put this next slide up.
João, você consegue passar? Let's see.
Sorry.
I don't want to slide. You can do it.
But maybe I can. Let me see.
Did it work? No.
Let me try to do this. Okay.
I can't click. Maybe if you if there's like exit the full screen. Oh yeah.
Do you see the next slide now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, good. So this is I've tried to organize my comments or my ideas around these few keywords. The first one being the context, and I think I'll come back to it. I've given some of it already. The next point, I want to make an argument, something to do about time, and specifically about what would happen if we all decided to waste less time. And I'll try to be more concrete what I mean with that. And then I think the core of what I want to speak to today, but also what I obviously would invite questions and comments around, is what are the epistemological and methodological implications of whatever we could seek to do. And then finally, really very much also centering the idea of purpose, something to do with purpose. So I guess the general invitation is to try and think through the implications of centering issues of race, racism, colonialism, racial capitalism in our study of IR, or we can call it the discipline of IR. But the first thing I would want to foreground is that I think engaging with that can never be at the service of IR for the sake of it, but has to do with something more than that. But it's trying to think about what happens when we take these themes seriously rather than just marginal, to how we just engage even in these issues. And another important thing is that I think it's important to foreground that issues of colonialism, racism, empire, all the horrible stuff that we can think of, embedded in the purpose is the fact that we can accept that they are not inevitable features, but they are constitutive features of the international, but they're not inevitable. Because if they were, then there is little, or then we don't even need that much time to say, yeah, there's racism in international relations. So I think for me today, the starting point is very much like, let's have a conversation as people to whom we don't have to convince that these things are important, real, and quite central. And then what happens when we do next? Whatever we can do next. And so I think that's where the context comes in. So the title of this talk comes from a review article I was asked to write for the Millennium Journal of International Studies. So it's a PhD student-run journal at the LSE, London School of Economics in London, in the UK. And the reason why I organized it around that is that I was invited to read 4 books and 1 special issue. And you know, I'm sure that afterwards I can share the information about the article, but also the specific books. But what was very particular about being commissioned to do that was that it was one after the other books and a special issue that really centered the issue of race, racism, colonialism, racial capitalism. So I was trying in that review to write about, on the one hand, the absolute joy I could feel to engage within the context of IR with books or artifacts that actually did not try to make the argument that race or racism or colonialism is important, but they actually did a whole scholarship that came after that. So that was the first thing. The other thing, and I really want to share that as well, is that I was completely a bit overwhelmed and intimidated, because a lot of what I was reading is stuff that I never had necessarily at university or in school, right? So one was, for instance, centered on Caribbean thinkers in very much detail. The other was about legal approaches to historical understandings of property, propriety. One book I was more familiar with is Claudia Ricker's White Innocence book, because it was based or talking about the Netherlands, and I'm from Belgium, the Flemish part, so I understood some of it. A lot of it was also political economy that I'm not that familiar with. So I was thinking, how do I review books and a special issue that I'm in full admiration of, that I feel is very urgent, but I also don't feel like saying, this is what I like, this is what I don't like, this is what they should have done, this is... So instead I decided to reflect on the places I was when I was reading these artifacts. And I'll come back to it in epistemology and methodology. So that's the first bit. But the thing that in context I wanted to center was this idea of writing from insecurity or writing from not knowing, but also writing from a sense of urgency. And what could that do? And the other, as I said, the picture of foreign policy is to somehow draw all our attention. And I know that Brazil has its own iterations of this, but it's when the politics of racism come to the fore of the public opinion debates, right? And what we see happening is that both within our disciplines, but also very much in a public debate, there is a ritualized discovery, rediscovery, and a ritualized consternation around race and racism. And on the one hand, and I'm always battling with that, so we think about Black Lives Matters, we think, for instance, in the UK, the statue of Edward Colston that was in Bristol, taken down and thrown in the sea. Every time I talk about it, I get happy again. Like there's this, I don't know if it's useful or not, but it's tiny joys of seeing that we seemingly do something or pushing forward certain consciousness. But on the other hand, we also know how easily that is neutralized, right? But for me, this is the wider context in which we are having these conversations about what I'm saying in the title is the double bind of, on the one hand, recognizing that attention to race and racism is nothing new, but we seem to keep on forgetting it. And on the other hand, it's something that is not just attended in our international relations discipline discussions, but it goes also hand in hand with the more mainstream conversations. And again, what are the implications of trying to embrace that? And I guess one of the things that I would flag up, the danger within the mainstream, is that it will do everything to co-opt or commodify these critical conversations into something that is so neutral that it feels like we've addressed it while keeping everything the same, right? So if we see, I don't know, Adidas, Nike, whatever, those are brands that I like, but if we see them, championing all this diversity and anti-racism things, again, not to say they shouldn't, or we see our universities talking about, I don't know, equality and diversity or whatever, and everything stays the same, but we just have a few more of our non-white faces around the board table. Those are the things. So that's the wider background. And I bring this up to make a point about time, because what I've come to understand, I guess, both within the academy, but also outside of it, is that a lot of our conversation about colonialism and empire, but also race and racism, have been designed, and that's where I come back to this ritualized consternation or the cyclical, to serve the status quo. So a lot of the conversations are designed as a distraction in and of itself, right? And a concrete example to give there is that, let's say in Belgium, for maybe the last 20 years, I've been active in anti-racist thinking, anti-racist writing columns as a journalist and some organizing. At some point, I had to come to the realization, obviously it is by engaging in a lot of anti-racist literature, that most of my time was spent in trying to make the argument that racism is real. And it sounds so trivial, right? But I think for me, this is what whiteness does, is that it occupies all our time for us to, in a respectable way, prove that these themes should be at the heart of the way we study the world. And so I guess, and I'm probably also working with people like Robbie Shilliam. I know he was also part of this series. When he speaks about the fact that we are not wedded to respond in a way that is linked to the imposition, right? So what happens if we decide to go beyond just talking back to whiteness, or just talking back to racism, or just talking, and so that includes all the research that maybe we put together to show the humanity of those that have been humanized. Or what I'm trying to say here is not to dismiss any of these efforts, but if we were to agree that time is finite, and if we do a division of labor, I think the invitation for me here is to think about how are we wasting time, is to connect that to the call to pluralize, or be more inclusive, or diversify, or whatever. It's not just to have randomly women or non-white faces around the table, but if we were to center other experiences than the white male heterosexual experience of life in general at the center of so much of what we are now discovering as the hot topics like racism, colonialism, whatever, would be there anyway. And so we wouldn't have to waste time to make the argument that they should be there. So I think that's one of the ways in which I would try to make the argument that diversification is not a problem, is never a sufficient condition, but the important element of it is that it potentially shifts our starting positions, our points of departure, but also can really accelerate different type of research agenda. So that's for me how I also distinguish it from just crude identity politics, where, because I happen to be a Black woman, I don't know, suddenly everything I say is true. It doesn't make any sense. But there is a particular value in a particular positionality on the one hand, because it's never been maybe part of the conversation. So that intellectually is already interesting. But then secondly is the relation of the positionality to power. And that is something that can be useful. And that for me brings me to what I want to say about epistemology and methodology. So I've been thinking about, what label I would put on it. And I guess the question is, what happens if we pass the microphone to some other folks, to put it very bluntly, right? So if we move away from, again, a white male heteronormative understanding of the world. And with white, I mean very much westernized. I mean very much not necessarily just a white skin color. We know these things, but somehow historically the centering of the European male experience of the world, and even it's not a real experience. It's a particular idealized one that probably not just any one white male has ever experienced, right? But there is a whole thing around whiteness that has a lot and nothing to do with reality. So what happens if we decide to somehow break that or recenter some of it? So for me, the epistemological question is, who has the microphone? And the first thing I would want to say about that is that the answer should not be a singular other microphone, right? So it's not to say, let's pass it on now to all Black women and then we've saved the world. But nevertheless, from my positionality, what I would offer is, or just explain, I think, why I've been trying to conceptualize my epistemological choices around the concept of epistemic Blackness, right? And the first thing I would want to say about epistemic Blackness is that it's more contingent than an ontological point that I want to make. Contingent in the sense that it's an open-endedness while being very much grounded in, again, particular power relations, but also particular absences and erasures in a particular context. So for me, epistemic Blackness makes sense in a world in which universities are westernized. So it's not even just universities in the West, but westernized universities. And the not even relative, but the very concrete absence of voices of people of African descent. And again, that's quite broad. So when we then make the argument why the voices of people of African descent, apart from the erasure, is useful in our rethinking of how the international works, once you start explaining that, a lot of it obviously has to do with the grounded history of kidnapping, enslavement, and enforced labor in the Americas, the diasporas that followed from that, and then the colonialism on the African continent itself. If you describe that, we arrive very soon at relations to humanization, dehumanization, exploitation, extraction, and particular forms of settler and other colonialisms. And so for me, when I say it's not contingent, but the open-endedness specifically, is that once I list all of that, we know that people of African descent are not the only ones to who this happens, right? So I think somehow with epistemic Blackness, I want to try to engage in a very grounded epistemology that is open to the extent that it doesn't claim an exceptionality. But there is an importance, I think, to still grounded in something very specific, because that's a place from which other loci of enunciation can be thought of, right? Or can be reached out to. So my whole thought is not finished on that, or the formulation of that, but this is something I especially wanted to put forward in a conversation with you all in a place like Brazil, where obviously Blackness has its own manifestations and iterations, but is by definition already deeply relational. And so the thing about epistemology, and on the one hand, who has the microphone as an open-ended question, but mostly who doesn't? I think that's maybe the better question, like who doesn't have the microphone systematically? And then, how can we extend that invitation? But then in my particular case, just throwing out there, what happens if we ground the understanding of the international around the philosophies and experiences of people of African descent, wherever they are? And how does that invitation already invite other positionalities? I mean, post-colonial studies have called them the subalterns, and anything you want, right? And then, so the /2 methodology then is to say that it requires also not just adding these voices to existing structure of knowledge making that we have within our discipline of IR, but then also maybe to understand how particular, maybe more marginalized methodologies or methods come to the fore as as natural parts of that conversation, but maybe also we can explore in how we can grow more confident in that. And again, maybe my starting point is more mainstream IR, but when we speak about the narrative or the everyday, I know like in continental Europe and through feminism as well, we have different iterations in which people have engaged with these so-called alternative approaches. I guess what I want to say about that here, and it's very specific to this review article as well. So I started by saying that I felt very insecure to even comment in a very judgmental way that is often expected from review articles. Like what did you do good and what did you miss out? I just, you know, when you feel the urgency, like I don't even need to agree or disagree, but whatever has been written or done in this artifact needs to be taken seriously, then we need different methods also, I think, to review each other's work or engage with them. And so that's why I opted to say, in the different places I am while I'm reading these books in this particular body, this is how I came to the title. And again, it also builds on work of other people like Errol Henderson, is that I started to understand, because, you know, the places that come up in the review article are, I'm living in the UK, and it was in the period that Donald Trump came to Portsmouth, where I live, to celebrate 70 years after the end of the First World War. And it's really difficult even to explain how offended I felt, but it was because everybody around me was more saying like, yeah, you know, he's the head of state of a nation that was part of the liberating forces, whatever. But I'm like, but he's really standing for similar ideals as those things that we're so-called liberated for. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And it, again, sounded so trivial. The other part of the review talks about going to the US to Toronto, Canada for an ISA conference. And for the first time, we decided to do land acknowledgement. And also I was traveling a little bit through New England there. And again, the banality of the fact that most of the city or town names there are exactly the same as in the UK. In my whole life, I usually laughed at these things, but the thing is, it's literally, it's the literal manifestation of settler colonialism that we've been socialized into finding so normal that it takes, I don't even know what it takes exactly, but it takes engaging with academic works that center settler colonialism for me to look up while I'm in a bus and seeing Bristol or whatever, but I'm in the US as names, to realize how so much in our face this is. And that brings me back to like, what time are we wasting to stuff that is literally in our face? And I guess for me, the invitation to focus on, and it's again, an open invitation, but other methodologies like narrative or everyday, because literally the colonial or empire is in our everyday, right? It's like everywhere we look, basically. So how can we make sure that we do not continue the socialization in how to cancel out these things and go straight to the big thinkers in our discipline, and then somehow maybe towards the end of our career, when we feel confident enough, we'll bring up racism, right? Whereas it's always been there. And so the rest of the paper talks about Puerto Rico or South Africa. And again, in all of these places, what we need to know about the international is literally in every place we go. But again, I want to, I guess, highlight the fact that the study of that we should make sure that we do not conflate the fact that it's all over the place with the fact that it's inevitable. And for me, that's the cracks with, or maybe that's also the challenge on how do we engage in every day, where if I walk the streets of London and once I look at any beautiful building, I know it really came on the backs and the blood, sweat, and tears of people in the colonies, to not just get stuck in that feeling of all-encompassing despair. And you know, like, we look at COVID today, I don't have to say this to anyone in Brazil, but it just feels all-encompassing, overwhelming, the ridiculousness of what the disregard of life is, right? At the heart of our politics, but also at the heart of our international system. But I think for me, the things that keep us going is that by observing its almost everyday banality, to not forget the fact that it did not have to go that way necessarily, right? So looking for the cracks in the everyday, I think, is very much what guides me here. And I guess that brings me to the very last bit of the methodology thing. And again, it's something that, I get from, for instance, Robbie Shillian, when he speaks about the distinction between knowledge production and knowledge cultivation, or Ariel Azulai speaking about deimperializing, or Julieta Singh speaking about unlearning mastery. I think it becomes more and more important for us to engage with a radical different purpose of knowing, so that it's not just to say like, oh, let's move on to the next school and we are the decolonial anti-racist school now, but the desires of mastery, the desires of expertise, very narrowly defined, of showing that we know more than others, or the finite, or the knowing first, knowing that, all of that, the aspect of colonial science, which tend to be knowing for the purpose of control. I think there is a huge invitation there to think about, what if our disciplines had not been born to control the colored nations, but to learn about how to know at the service of life, and life in general. I wouldn't even confine it to the human, let's say. So I've been trying to think about indiscriminate life in dignity. What would that look like? And I think this is where I would say it's quite important to, when we engage with the colonial, with empire, with race, racism, racial capitalism, how can we do that in a way that does not reproduce the classical ways of knowing that we've had so far? And that involves both purpose, but also then methods and methodologies, right? And I'm not always sure what this should look like. I also think it's really important to not try and define what this should look like for everyone at all times. But I think I want to highlight the fact that this has very little to do with relativism, in the sense that everything goes. It's just that we really reshift the imperative to what Enrique Dussel, for instance, distinguished as the will to life over the will to power. But just the discipline, let's redefine IR as a discipline not of conquest, but and with conquest, I think it's also important that we call what conquest is a disregard of majority of life. It's not even some accidental death, less left and right, but the same way that capitalism operates as a system of political economy that benefits a tiny minority on planet Earth. That's always been the case. So the shift of the purpose to a discipline, or do we even need a discipline, but a science or a desire of knowing for something else than mastery and control and power for the sake of it, but one that informs us how we can combat premature death, I guess. And so that, I think in and of itself, this is where I want to bring it back to, and I don't think there's better time than the present to bring all of this discussion back to questions of life and death, rather than, I don't know, the next school in our disciplines, or just having the word decolonial in every paper that we write, right? But can we come back to some of its purposes? And I think it has implications in terms of who we give the microphone to, what methods we use, but also very much in a very practical, pragmatic way. It helps us save time, because a lot of the frameworks that we are given to think in have been designed for the status quo and to delay any of the radical thought we might have. But it's, I think, good also to think of the context. However much misery around us, I think we have more language, let's say, than in the last 5 or 10 years to make the arguments that we're trying to make today for the different things that have been happening around the world, not in the least the completely avoidable COVID deaths, but also very much the disregard for Black life in particular. Good, so I'm gonna stop here, 31 minutes, but I'm really looking forward to any question, comments you might have. Yeah, please take it away. And I think we can also stop the slides from sharing, but I can do that, I think. There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Olivia, very much. I was like taking notes and reflecting on what you were saying. We have some questions coming in. So João, I'll just speak in Portuguese so we can like arrange things. Quem quiser perguntar, pode mandar. O Rafael já perguntou, pode mandar, e a gente vai fazendo a tradução. So, Rafael, a friend from ISA, has asked how has been your experience relating to the reception that your students have, by taking race and racism in IR seriously. He says that his perception is that he sees lots of especially Black students anxious for these kinds of discussions. So what has been your experience in relate to this kind of things put in practice in the classroom? Like,
yeah. So thank you, Rafael. Hi, for this question. No, because it really helps me to make the point about how epistemology and the topics are connected to the methods that we use, and that's not just research, right? But in the classroom, for instance, so my classroom in the UK, strangely enough, and I don't know if it's random or not, but anytime I went to uni, I was the only Black person in the room, whether I was as a teacher or whether I was in the room as a student. The UK is not necessarily the same, but the books are the same, the topics are the same, so whiteness is a bit everywhere, right? So I think I already disrupt that by being a Black person in front of them, but what I was started to realize quite quickly is that to bring these topics in a classroom where there might be visible diversity, but still there is a supremacy, and I don't mean this in a nasty way, but the supremacy of whiteness within that classroom was to break the division between me in front of the class and them sitting there and listening to me. Because weirdly enough, you still do have a lot of power as a person in front of the class. So I think I was also a bit afraid to, I don't know, I don't mind brainwashing students. I think education is about brainwashing, but there is the danger where you know that you have so much power that you can guilt trip students without them going through the motions and the thinking that, oh yeah, we should accept what she says because you know because she gives us the grades and all of that. So more and more, I think, and I started this now even in the first year, I select readings that sometimes are quite uncomfortable or difficult or any of these things. But rather than start teaching, I start first with every single person in the class, just singling out one thing that struck them in the reading. So what you read this, what made, what did you connect it to? What did you think of it? So it's not even a test. They don't have to summarize any of it. I just want to, and I found that became a huge equalizer because both the students of African descent, for the first time, they were actually asked what they thought of this, but they were not singled out because the white male, the white female, all the other students as well had to tell us what they thought. So for instance, with Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism, some students said, oh my God, that's such an emotional text. Somebody else said, like, he sounds like a racist. Somebody else said, for the first time, I finally see how civilization and colonialism is not the same, and I feel heard and seen. And so I think that has allowed for an agenda setting of the students without necessarily me telling them how they need to think about this. But obviously, I do still the agenda setting in the sense of I want you guys to read Aimé Césaire, right? In your first or your last year of undergraduate studies. So I guess a long-winded answer to say it's a lot of these discussions require different methods in the classroom rather than just different topics. And then the thing that I've learned more and more is that students prefer to learn from each other than necessarily just the two-way between the lecture and the because it's just less threatening. So it's really thinking about the power in the classroom. That would be my answer.
Okay, we have some more comments that came from Raul. João, can you project them? And then I have a question as well. I think it's more like a comment than a question. Good afternoon. I completely agree with your points. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, he had to, fracture the comment because of the word limit. Representative discourses and agendas. Yes. There are two others, I guess. Have any suggestions on how we can take up space in academia?
Yeah.
Okay, and there, I think there's one last. Yeah. I don't. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So this is also the same class as yours, right, João? He's your colleague from yours, the same.
Yeah, he's one of my best
friends.
And
an awesome student as well.
I agree with him. I feel the same as him. It's a really interesting question. I want to hear it.
No, I thank you so much, Raul, for the question. So the taking up of space. So usually when I introduce myself, again, I'm going to come very long-winded to answer the question, but I'm thinking out loud. As I mentioned, I'm from Belgium, but also from Rwanda. But it's what I then often also do is to trace where my interest in international relations came from. And in my particular case, it's as a second-generation Rwandan. As a teenager, I was a teenager when the genocide happened in Rwanda, right? And I had two main discourses that happened in my life. The one was obviously my Rwandan family, from whom I could feel, even though I was not that politicized, stuff that happens in your home country, your parents talk about, whatever. But I just felt this was different. So I had an apocalyptic feeling of something humongous is happening. And on the other hand, my everyday life in school, but also, I grew up in a white Flemish family, but also on TV or the radio, or this was just projected as another thing of random people in Africa killing each other. And so I remember thinking how are these two worlds happening at the same time? And I was even in Belgium, a former colonizer of Rwanda, whatever, so there should have been an interest in that. And so afterwards, when I started thinking, how did I even come to choose international relations as an area of specialty, is very much from the observation that in class, I would get stories about the West, human rights, moral high grounds, the UN, peacekeeping operations, all of that. And those stories sounded like the West is somehow at the pinnacle, is amazing. And if they can, they go and help people. And then my actual experience of literally the night the genocide started, the UN retreated and 1 million people were killed. That's the story. So so a long-winded answer to say that when we try, or when we say, how can we claim space? I think it's important to have moral clarity why we would do that, right? There is an intellectual clarity that is there. If our voices are absent, our participation means that the discipline will get more interesting, full stop. So intellectually, we don't even need to argue that much. But understanding that the whole of IR is so deeply masculinist, heteronormative, whatever, if you come in from a different positionality, it will be intellectually interesting anyway. So that doesn't even require that much. But I think to sustain ourselves, if we can connect it to what generally matters, and that's why I often come back to the seemingly quite generic, it's literally about life and death in most cases, even though we've been taught how to cancel that out or erase that a little bit. For me, that makes that we understand that often the biggest impediment is the fact that we feel we need to justify our presence. Whereas if you can connect your presence to a sense of urgency, that really doesn't concern any of those gatekeepers that try to keep you out. But both intellectually and morally, you kind of need to be there in a way that is not about you. Like, it's not about me being heard. It's not even about me speaking for all my people. It's just understanding the huge gaps in the existing literature and how you can be a tiny conduit in that. So yeah, I guess that would be my answer. Like, let's not wait for legitimacy that is given by others. Again, like Robbie said, like, let's not wait for the answer of the imposition. But if we have our own logics for our presence, then we need to answer to questions of rigor for ourselves that are based on another logic. So that was my point about purpose. I hope I did answer it, because it's a really important question, but those would be the first things I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and also just to be clear, Raul is also a very great student that's making a very, very good research project, and I'm like tutoring him now. So shout out to Raul that has a great project and talks about these kind of things. So it's very, very important. Olivia, I have like two questions. So if I can, use this kind of power of being here for me, and João also, if you have any other questions. So I first I need to tell a little story. That I think that the only time I hesitate about being in international relations field was when I was an undergrad. I was like almost finishing my my course, somewhat where João is right now. And I asked one of my professors and now great friend, why are we doing IR? And that's the only time where I freaked out about what I was doing, all these kind of things. And every now and then I come across this question. And the thing is, and you were mentioned about, let's redefine IR as a discipline. And I'm struggling right now with the question that can we save, IR from these kind of whiteness, West-centric, these kind of, ideas, or is IR worth saving, the way it was built, in a sense, like the house is on fire. We're not putting out the fire if we stay inside the house, we need to get out of the house, and maybe the house needs to, go to the ground. And I say this mainly because, and then to connect with this, so first let's your take on that, and then to connect with this about the time question, the time issue. So, and these are kind of dark times around the world, we see stupid people publishing stupid ideas on high impact journals, and we see, friend of ours being, followed on Twitter and these kind of things just to, so is this part of, we need to some sort of try to make sense of these people. Are they like worth engaging with? Because they do have prime time on media. They do have prime, they have spaces to talk about. They become presidents of ISA or other places, and and then this comes to mind because the first time I went to the ISA, I went to talk about agricultural cap, in the European Union. So I was in a room filled with Europeans, white Europeans, and when I start talking that this is problematic, especially because I was from a country that we export these kind of things, so it's kind of bad that they do that. And then they play this kind of I come from Europe card, and you don't do good quality research. And I was really bummed. I mean, I found GDS.
Yeah.
But then I have to remind myself, it's kind of a bubble, right? So should we save IR, or is it worth saving, or should we talk to these guys? I mean, right now in Brazil we have this kind of problems. People go into protest like for the virus. It's stupid. But yeah, so how we think about that? I mean, these kind of troubling times, because and then we have one more question, but then I think I should pass to you now, Olivia, and then we have a question from Carolina Condé.
Yeah. So no, these are really the crucial questions. So why are we doing IR? Is it worth saving? And then is it worth putting our time in, let's say, the white supremacist mainstream? Let's just call it that, because it doesn't even require neo-Nazis, whatever. It's like you say, you go to an average ISA panel, and whiteness is at the center of the sense making. It does not require bad people. They're not evil or whatever. It just and so on the first question, I would say what academia has trained us to do is to put the logic of the university and of IR as a discipline at the center of why we're doing whatever we're doing, whether it's teaching, whether it's researching, whether it's publishing. And I guess the reason why I always come back to the story of how I got to the discipline is that it's actually the reverse. So for me, I really very much see disciplines as instruments to make sense of the world. And so in that sense, I'm not necessarily saving a particular form of IR or IR as for the sake of it. But if we see IR as an instrument to do something else, then for me, the conversation is worth it. But I'm not wedded to IR as a discipline. I generally don't care if there's other instruments that allow me to make sense of the world. So for me, that's where the idea of interdisciplinarity, or the fact that I don't even have to stay within the academy, because we tend to be so narrow-minded that there's so much we don't see. But that also gives me the ease to not say I don't have to dispense with IR, because it's one of the instruments to make sense of the world, but also one of the centers of power in which all the others are also making sense of the world, right? And so that brings me to your second question, where is it worth it engaging? Like full disclosure, I made you change a little bit my old bio, whatever, because it was so Eurocentric, but I literally ran from EU studies and European Union studies. Apart from this, some boring elements to study European Union documents. It's just tediously boring. But it's the desperation of having to put so much energy to break out of this fantasy of the EU as a benign thing, or as a neutral thing, as a good thing that we just technically will study, right? So the same as you, GDS kind of saved me in that sense. But again, I think Robbie said once, like, there is a difference between audience and your constituency, right? And constituency would be, again, those that are connected to your purpose. Why would you study whatever you chose to study? Hopefully, they are not just the reviewers or the editors of the journals you apply to, or even your colleagues, but that's so much broader. But at the same time, and I think that's where I locate a lot of my activism, is we need a certain, and I think what we sometimes underestimate is that we already have it, because the mainstream is so all present. It's really good to train ourselves on how to very briefly engage with that white supremacist mainstream. So in that sense, it's not an either or. And I think it's more a question of division of labor and division of time. So at some point, again, when I was still working as a journalist, but also more as an activist, I think I wrote an op-ed once saying, I have decided to not spend time on defining racism in our conversations. And these are the 3 bullet points through which I will do this, and that's it. So it's about thinking if we have 100% kind of time to, rather than spend 70% of that time in engaging that mainstream, and then 30% maybe if we manage to like really dislocate our own minds from their questions, to then go and do the archival or other works that we need to do to actually see those cracks and study the cracks, to flip that around. So it's not an either or, but it's about the ratio. So now when I go to ISA, most of the panels I would go to are those that that give me life. So many of them are GDS or whatever. But I will always select a handful where I'm in the audience, where the more mainstream, so that I don't need to do the literature reviews, because I hear from them what they're talking about today.
Yeah.
And you get a quick sense of, oh my God, okay, this is. So it's maybe a very pragmatic way of engaging with it, but it's, again, understanding that we are not wedded to their agenda, but their agenda tends to be the most powerful one. So just in terms of knowing, we need to engage with it, but not because we owe them anything. And I think is really, really important, because it's also how we ended up with a lot of critical research that is still just answering to them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we don't need to study how to answer the Bolsonaros of these worlds, because those discourses, we are so intimately aware of them. But we can literally spend months and months and months getting super angry at any tweet that defends them. But after 3 tweets, we know what the discourse is. We don't need to go into detail unless your research is really about documenting that, right? We don't have to. So we need to trust that we understand it, and then say, if that were not the framework of life, but it's the framework of death, what do I need to research to make the cracks that exist bigger than what are there? But I think also it's important to think of it collectively. So you never have to answer this as an individual. So if you're a group of people, you can divide the work amongst you and say, this month, you have the pleasure to read all the racist shit. And then next month, I'll do it. And next month, I will be focusing on all the anti-colonial literature that has been written, whatever. Also just for your own mental well-being. I think it's important to think in those very practical terms. Like, how do we divide the work amongst us?
Okay, thank you. We have another question here from Carolina Condé, a very dear friend. João, do you want to put it up and translate?
Her question is about the narrative discussions about the Palestinian question narrative, and it's like, how can we position ourselves but not take the locus of enunciation of Palestinians, because people can only hear, like, people only listen to us when we are not Palestinians talking about this issue. I don't know if I said everything.
No, it's so, yeah, it's, if I understand correctly, it's both about taking certain narratives seriously and not appropriating them either.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And also, I think also, if I may add, I mean, when a Palestinian says something, it's usually discredited, saying you are from, this kind of special place, and you are trying to advance some sort of an agenda, so, and then you have this kind of, I think that is, I mean, Carol can confirm to us, but I think it's kind of this kind of balance, Yeah.
No, so for me, that question touches on the heart of what I'm a lot of my research is about anti-colonial solidarity, right? Like, what does solidarity look like if we don't reproduce coloniality, basically speaking, for somebody else, or so-called helping when you actually have to repair something, or and I guess the question is posed quite generally, but a lot of the answers would need to be quite specific. But I think on a moral level, we kind of know. We know when we pretend that we're experts about something that we're not experts, but then present ourselves. So it's, again, the desire for mastery to some extent. But we can think of ourselves as conduits itself as well, understanding that if If I say something, even if I'm a Black woman but located in the West, that translates something that I hear from colleagues in the global South. I guess the moral imperative for me is not to pretend that I came up with it myself, but that generally you don't speak for them, but you can even mention, I'm bringing it up because I know if they say it that you can't hear it or see it, right? So it's understanding on the one extent the power that you have that others might not have, without desiring or benefiting from that power once you relay those things that you've learned. And so that's for me is where, for instance, in my teaching or research about aid and development, where I have found it quite important to think more in terms of restitution and repair. And so I think when we amplify Palestinian voices, that we don't amplify the disembodied victimness or victimhood, but that we make sure that we don't erase the political story behind it, the one of resistance, even if it makes us uncomfortable, we're not sure what Hamas is, does, whatever. But on the other hand, that we don't pretend that we're not part of that conversation. So how does us hearing or engaging with Palestine engage our political positionality in terms of restitution and repair, right? And for instance, in Europe, that's quite, it's quite clear to the extent that the creation of Israel is a European negation or exportation of its own problem of extermination towards the Jewish people. That is completely ignored in all of it, right? And even BBC, that they just try to, they're only comfortable now to talk about children and women because that's the great equalizer. We depoliticize it and just people are suffering on both sides of the. So I think one way to not to be respectful of the locus of enunciation and of the power dynamics is to think, what does my engagement with Palestine translate into politically? And obviously politically, if it's in the classroom or research, also means obviously in terms of research, right? And I guess for me, it just helps to think, where does it fit into studying settler colonialism, which again brings many more people into the conversation. And we know it's in other forms of colonialism, racism, extermination, all of that. And that's where we also see the natural links that seem to be there with indigenous communities in the Americas, but also Black Lives Matter activism, whatever. So that's a positive way to translate positionality, where you link it to bigger themes. And then you commit yourself to, next time we speak about coloniality, we don't pretend that Palestine is not at the forefront of that. Something like that. Again, very, very vague because because I'm also really thinking about that, like how to, and sometimes I think like we need to think about those struggles that we know intimately that maybe have affected ourselves. How would we want other people to speak to that? It helps us sometimes, so because at no point do we ever want to be seen as just the victims, even if we know that we could get political advantage from it or whatever. But when it pertains our family members, when it pertains our own dignity, whatever, how would we want others to engage? And often it means don't pretend you know everything, but also often it means next time you are in a panel on settler colonialism, and if you don't even bring up Palestine, what are you doing? How can we be in solidarity then, right? All of this, I don't have a very clear answer, but those are some of the things that come to my mind.
Thank you. I think if we have time, like for one more question, we have Emily. João, if you can project. I think maybe we are almost running out of time, so I will translate that for you. So she would like to know, you as a Black woman, how do discriminatory practices and some sort of obstacles, both in the area of gender and in the racial area, prevent the conduct of women who aspire to be in positions in academia or diplomacy, especially given the dominance of white Western and patriarchal social cultural values that continue to undermine women's prospect for aspiring and thriving in spaces oriented in these areas. So some sort of advice, I guess.
Well, so I'm gonna try to give not two answers, but two places where for me now, the biggest challenge are. And one is the challenge, I think, of tokenism and just the Benetton adding of Black women to anything that happens in the world. And the other is our own internalizing of the exclusion, so the imposter syndrome thing. I actually think that those are the two biggest dangers, not even the attempts of others to exclude us, because that, again, we are experts in that. That happens anyway. If you happen to be in university already, that's also a small miracle already, whatever. So these things, we just need to realize that we are actually experts on how discrimination works. And that should give a sense of confidence there. But to speak to the other, so the tokenism thing, and I guess for me, especially, I moved to the UK 8 years ago, and the UK is very sophisticated in its exclusionary practices because on the surface, it's not racist. Obviously, it's against racism. And again, when I compare it to Belgium, it's true. In the UK, I see many more people of color in positions of power. And I'm an example in it myself. The danger there, though, is that we always need to investigate what the conditions are upon which we are allowed in. And often, once we're allowed in, it's on the condition of assimilation to the extent that it almost wouldn't matter that much whether we were a white, heterosexual man or whether we are a Black woman. And so that's what I would say. Really keep that in mind as a challenge. It's not a problem when you know that you've been hired just because they needed to reach a certain quota. For me, I call that micro reparations. Like, you've excluded us for so long, even if you just hire me because I'm a Black woman, go ahead, no problem. The challenge that does not go away, and I actually say that's no problem because I know I already had to be better than most to even get there, right? To be even considered. So we should never waste even time to feel bad. But the actual challenge is to make sure that our presence counts more than just window dressing. And that's where it becomes really much more difficult, because if along the way you understand that engaging for real with race and racism, for instance, in my case, in international development, means that at some point I need to advocate for the abolishment of international development studies. And you know that the lifespan of claims like that is not that long. But at the other side, the institutions will be so happy with themselves that they've been able to tick two boxes, right? And then the other one, the imposter syndrome, again, it's not something that only befalls people of color or women. Is this feeling that somebody made a mistake, that there's a little glitch and you were never supposed to be there. And often that's even true, right? But I think I come back to the things that I've been trying to say throughout, is that intellectually, our presence within the academy is an exciting event, because the experiences, the insights that we come with, for any just neutral definition of what knowledge making is about, meaning understanding more, understanding better how life works, the fact that so far only, Grossfogel would say, 6% of the world population has been invited formally to engage with that, that should give us the legitimacy to be there, mediocre or not, in excellence or not. It's just, let's make sure that it counts. And so that they don't just count our heads and say, oh, I have 5 women on my panel, I'm good. But has there been has there been an actual effect, like a generally impact when we start shifting, you know, the Snow White's composition of of academia into this whole Benetton thing where it seemingly looks different and diverse? It needs to matter. There needs to be implications, right? So, but in the everyday, very practical advice thing, I would just say, like, try to move in the world as a mediocre white man, and how they assume that they have the right to be everywhere. Just do that, because you come with expertise anyway. If you survive that long and you manage to be there to apply for whatever, you can be sure that you bring something more to the table than others. And even that doesn't matter, but that's really quite important. But just don't try to believe in the ways in which they try to keep us out. But I would say the real challenge is, once you're in, make sure that it's meaningful. Otherwise, let them do the white mediocre things. Like, they don't need us to do that.
Yeah, thank you. So, João, do we have more questions, or do you want to make a question?
No, we don't have any more questions in here. I think maybe we can finish soon because of our timing.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
People
So,
are thinking now.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So I would like to thank you, Olivia, for your time and for being here with us. It's important to say that we were together. We're here for like 1 hour ish, and according to the statistics that we have here in Brazil, around 77 people died from COVID during this time. So it is important to understand that right now we are doing some sort of investigations in our Congress, and we now understand that we had 100 million vaccine offers that were literally just ignored. And then we see when we see vaccinations and vaccination rates, we see that the majority of people that are being vaccinated right now are white and rich people. So it gives us some sort of sense of responsibility while teaching, because and this is what I've talked with a friend of mine. Understanding neorealism, structural realism, or these kind of things does not help me to understand what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in India. Does not help us to understand that people literally died because they didn't have enough oxygen in Manaus, for instance. So it's not just a question of it's just bad theory, but it's a theory that is designed to silence our voices, but to literally kill us in what I've described as some sort of necropolitics of abandonment. You know, you just leave them be, and we will die. You know, so having these kind of conversations is so inspirational, because we understand that we are in the right side of history. We understand that there are people around the world that empathizes with all our problems, and is stand in solidarity with us as we stand with you and other struggles. So it is very, very important for us. I recently conducted this kind of Instagram poll with my friends, and I think it was more than 100 votes, and only 7 people didn't know anyone who did not die from COVID. So it's going to be a really, really big trauma. But in these Zoom, situations that we've been through are very, very tiresome, very, excruciating bad. But having this opportunity to talk with you and to learn from you and from others who made their comments is very, very, something that we should value during this difficult time. So I really thank you. You gave us a lot of inspiration and strength to move forward. So this is something that I need to appreciate and thank you. And obviously, when it will finish, we will defeat it, you will definitely be here. We will move all our strength to have a meeting here, because I think you'll see the campus is absolutely beautiful. We're all missing it, yeah.
I'll be
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. I think we're finalizing it. So, okay. Thank you, everybody, for watching us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
A gente vai finalizar aqui agora. Obrigado mesmo pela presença, gente. And Olivia, I believe I'm saying this, all the students will agree with me. It is a complete honor. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Obrigado, gente. Tchau, tchau.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.